SEP FanFic Readings presents Measure of a Man by Days 22. Chapter 22, Sky Full of Stars. July 21st, 2011. Deafening. Eerie. The aftermath was silent. Time slowed to a crawl. Everything significant blurred as her mind filled the seconds between the observations. Scorpius was inside. Malfoy was next to her. Teddy. Before Hermione could reach for the latter, who had covered his ears and raised his head to stare at the dark mark, there was another noise that made him step to her. Distance did little to dampen the sound, like a cannon breaking down the entrance to the fortress, and it didn't stop Hermione's heart from thundering in her chest as her ears from ringing. The instinct to run towards the danger was only stopped by the boy in front of her and the hand on her wrist. Godric's Hollow's first distress beams raced into the sky, scattering far and wide before fading. And then there was ominous silence layered under a sound. Voices that hadn't been there before. People. Two figures appeared beyond her diversion wards, masked and cloaked in black. The tips of their wands pulsed white. Then a second set arrived, wands already drawn. Hermione itched to react, but Malfoy's grip tightened in command that needed no words. Don't. She relaxed and wrestled with her impulse to charge. Trust your wards. Malfoy was right. Hermione exhaled and loosened her grip around the wand she'd instinctively drawn from the pocket of her dress. The figures started searching for something she knew they would eventually find. She worried they might have already found it when one stopped, appearing to look right at them. The ward. One of them tilted their masked head and stepped closer. From where she stood, Hermione could see their grip on their wand just as tight as hers. But they tripped the distraction ward instead, and it flared to life. All clear. He turned and started towards the others. Each movement was unnatural and jerky. Nothing here. Let's go. No. The figure that snarled looked like the leader. The tracker's been bringing us here for weeks. Weeks? Just send him here to look himself if he's that desperate. Him. Panic rose like bile, thick and acidic. It burned in her throat. Her tongue was stuck to the roof of her mouth as she looked to Malfoy, catching the precise moment that waiting them out was no longer a viable option. They had to act. He dropped her hand and drew his wand, bringing his finger to his lips. She nodded. Wards were powerful and constructed with advanced spells, but they were still subject to the universal rules of magic. With enough power, they could be built or torn down. Strong, but not perfect. The imperfection in hers? They weren't soundproof. With her cottage far off the main road, there hadn't been a need. The only people who could see her home were those who knew exactly where it was located. Those who belonged. Those who didn't could only see if they were close enough to hear that something was there. Maybe. As the other three began closing in on where their cohort had been, careful steps closer and closer. Hermione's confidence waned. Her wards could handle being exposed, sure, but an all-out attack? She didn't want to find out. A second distress signal shot up from Godric's Hollow. Electric anticipation accompanied the uptick in the wind. It was ominous beyond any words she could express. She turned Teddy's head away from the men and forced him to look at her and only her. His rapidly changing hair color showed his peaking distress. Closer and closer they approached until another distant explosion distracted them. Malfoy covered Teddy's mouth before he could gasp, a human noise where none should have been. He hushed the teenager with a universal gesture until the boy nodded. Hermione offered the first plan, Teddy to the house while they both dispatched the intruders. It was instantly rejected. Malfoy pointed at the two of them, then the house, mouthing one word, go. Hermione opened her mouth. She was more than capable of fighting, but Malfoy's dangerous look left no room for argument. Not that she had the time. The next blast forced them all to move, timed perfectly with the next set of actions. Her front door opened, Harry appeared, and Hermione pushed Teddy in his direction. A hand on her back propelled her forward as well, and a split-second stern glare made her comply. Teddy made it to Harry, and Hermione was almost to the door when there was a soft pop, followed by a deep, distant rumble that felt and sounded like an earthquake. It was then that she noticed Malfoy wasn't behind her, but it didn't take much to find him. In theory, Hermione knew that he had been an Auror in France. She knew that he had been trained to fight effectively. Stealth, charms, defense. Malfoy had the skills to handle himself, and must have been successful to have made it as far in his career as he had. But knowing he was capable was far different than seeing him in action. Malfoy was strong and confident to the point of arrogance, intelligent and calm enough during a high-stress situation to make prudent decisions, and, well, it was quite the visual. It was enough for Hermione to actually stop and watch as he made short work of the intruders. He appeared behind them with a loud crack enough to draw their attention, using their moment of distraction against them with a fluid yet brutal effectiveness. One spell threw them at her wards, which rebounded them. They landed in a messy heap of limbs that made the healer in her wince. A quick turn and a second spell aimed at the last one, who was still dazed after his interaction with her distraction wards, and it was all taken care of. Malfoy straightened his tie, ran a smooth hand down his shirt, and summoned all of their wands in one go. Hermione blinked twice, swallowing around the forming lump in her throat. Harry apparated to his side, and she looked back at the doorway where Teddy remained alone, hair changing at a slower rate. Well, she hadn't heard him disapparate. Malfoy handed Harry the collected wands as the two started talking, likely detailing what had transpired. Hawthorne still pointed. Malfoy used his foot to roll over the first unconscious body with a disregard that made it obvious for how little he cared about being gentle. Further proof came in the form of him stunning the intruder, who started moving without so much as blinking twice. Then the other three earned stunners too, just to be safe. Harry grimaced, but ultimately appeared wholly unsurprised by Malfoy's methodical ferocity. Hermione was watching them so hard she nearly forgot about Teddy until he reminded her. "Did you see that?" At her sharp look, he immediately looked sheepish. "I can talk now, right?" "I did, and yes, you can." Tucking a bit of fringe behind her ear, Hermione shook off the strange feeling that tried to creep up. "Teddy—" They both heard his name being called by his grandmother, and he tore off back into the house. He was gone no more than a second before Theo and Pansy emerged, wands in hand. Pansy eyed her from her feet to her crown with a dark arching brow. "I see you're unharmed." "I am. Everything is fine, except—" Hermione pointed at the dark mark, then at Harry and Malfoy as they received a Patronus that caused them to exchange grimaces. Adrenaline began to recede, and her mind started to clear, returning one last thing to focus. "Scorpius is in the living room." Theo raised a hand between them. "He's fine. A bit jumpy. Daphne had to stop him from going back outside, so she's distracting him with the plant book from your conservatory." Hermione exhaled her relief. "I've already called for everyone on emergency duty." Theo frowned up at the dark mark. "That would normally include you, Hermione, but that wouldn't be prudent." Her agreement was interrupted when robed figures started appearing around Harry and Malfoy. All thankfully bore ministry robes. Navy, not Aura black. The French task force automatically deferred to Malfoy. Hermione watched him give instruction, likely in French, given the blankness on Harry's face that clearly meant he didn't understand. He lifted his head with an air of authority. His face looked crisp as the hand movements that accentuated his words. It was clear there was no room for questions, only confirmation that would execute his directives. When Malfoy finished dictating, the team went about securing the unconscious intruders with incarcerous spells and left with them soon after. Once alone, the two checked their perimeter and returned inside her wards with barely audible pops. Harry looked a bit pressed, but Malfoy appeared as composed as ever. "We have to handle that?" Pansy pointed at the sky. "Obviously, Potter." To Malfoy, she gave a meaningful look. "Let someone know when you're home." And that was it. "I've already called in every emergency personnel," Theo said to both of them. "The hospital is ready to accept injured people. Anything further needed from St. Mungo's. We already had teams on guard duty when the explosion started, and they called in support. Malfoy and I just received the initial reports from the French task force." "And?" Hermione wrung her hands in a show of nervous worry about the village she'd visited multiple times. All those people. We heard multiple explosions. Bombs were set all over the village, mostly decoys to cause chaos and panic, but the last one was detonated in the building where the village leaders were meeting. That one was laced with poison. That drew Theo's attention. "Powder form?" Theo swallowed as he nodded. "Malfoy's French team was there and quickly sealed off the building with everyone inside, so I'll get the poison teams mobilized and decontamination set up. Do you think any of it got into the air?" "I certainly hope not." We're going to canvass to make sure no Death Eaters are still in the village, and they will likely be a briefing after. Harry wearily ran a hand through his hair. Let me go tell Ginny. Harry excused himself as Theo stepped off to the side to ascend a Patronus. His lynx sprang forth in the wispy clouds that he spoke to. Pansy's eyes went back to the sky, and once again Malfoy was out of sight. Granger. Names were powerful, and the way he said hers made her stomach twist into a tight knot beneath her ribcage. Hermione couldn't take a deep breath without feeling something pressing its way in, or trying to, and not for the first time. Her body was as stubborn as her mind. It was a battle she was beginning to lose as the lie in her truth began shifting her focus. That knot she called unknown, or nothing. Hermione knew damn well what it was. When Malfoy said her name again, his voice was lower, closer. Hermione went from watching Theo, dumbly glancing at Pansy, to swiveling around to Malfoy, who stood just behind her. How she hadn't felt his presence was a mystery. He was close enough that she could fall into him. What is it? He's inside with Daphne. Hermione blew out a breath, anxious but safe. When Malfoy looked to the doorway, jaw clenched the same way it had been in the picture on his desk, Hermione didn't know what to do with her hands, so she brought them together. I'll talk to him. She knew there wasn't much time, and there was no telling how Scorpius would react to him leaving. Malfoy nodded, and after a beat of silence, Your wards are sufficient enough. Hermione had figured as much when he'd rebounded 3 intruders off of them. Furthermore, none of my team members saw your home. I still believe they need to be tested, as there are Death Eaters tracking near the edge of your boundaries. My guess is they're following any remnant traces of Mather's blood. Give it as a message to you and what happened to Potter's house after that. I won't state the obvious about the interest in you. I'm not moving, Malfoy. This house means... Of course not. He interjected before Hermione could launch into what would likely be a passionate tirade. The irritation in his tone was plainly written on his face. I doubt anyone here could force you out, but stubbornness alone won't keep incidents like this from happening. I can assist, but only if you don't fight me every step of the way. There were at least 3 retorts ripe and ready to roll off the tip of her tongue, but she slowed down enough to listen and look at the man speaking to her. Hadn't she made a similar offer to him not long ago? Yes, she had, on a different but equally as important topic. He was returning the favor, and that settled her hackles. Fine, but no security detail. Hermione put her foot down on that. Are you finished? It wasn't his question that made her freeze, but the deliberate way he'd asked it. The way he slightly learned to exaggerate their difference in height. His challenging expression and hands slipped into his pockets, the picture of perturbed ease. I suppose I am. After shifting her body in an attempt to loosen the tension of the day, Hermione tried not to fidget. Malfoy's eyes cut above hers, mouth slipping and settling into a firm line on whatever he saw. She didn't turn, and he changed the subject, becoming more official. We're sending a team to canvass the area and stationing guards outside of your wards. I would advise you to move the location of this event. Malfoy toyed with his silver cufflinks. My mother will likely volunteer our home for the new venue. Of course. That made perfect sense. Will you stay with them until I return? There was intensity in his expression that told Hermione this was more potent than a request. This was him tapping into the piece of himself he had given her last month with the kettle he'd left on. Trust. She knew this wasn't easy for him. I will. She looked down, feeling strangely restless while attempting to decode and analyze their interaction. The earth had no answers, so Hermione looked to the sky. The dark mark had faded like a bad memory, showing that the Aurors and Task Force had control of the situation. But then Hermione found herself right back at the start, back to the gray eyes that were narrowed with a blend of questions and scrutiny. Whatever she was about to say, truth be told, Hermione didn't know herself, died in her throat when Harry returned. Ready? Harry's eyes were still on her. Yes. And then they were both gone. Hermione exhaled as she turned and froze. There were 2 people watching her. Theo's expression was strategically blank. She didn't like that at all. And Pansy, well, Pansy had never been timid. Her expression was pleasant, friendly even, but the glint in her eyes promised an ambush. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday in the near future. Hermione hoped Pansy would bring something stronger than wine when that day came. They would need it. Pansy went back inside, leaving her and Theo alone. The atmosphere around them had settled from the earlier chaos, and peace had reclaimed its control over the area. For now. Hermione took one last look before going inside. Theo followed, shutting the door behind him. Voices carried from the living room, likely about moving the party. Hermione, meanwhile, was making a list of things she needed to do before locking down. Soundproofing the chickens had already been a priority before the guests had arrived. Food and water for them were her primary concerns. The rest could wait. "What did Draco say to you?" "He asked me to stay with Narcissa and Scorpius. Simple as that." Theo's expression gave away even less than his words. "Is it really?" A spark of annoyance died just as it began to flare. Scorpius peeked around the corner, which turned her frown into an earnest smile. Hermione extended her hand, every bit the invitation it was intended to be, a lifeline offered with fluid ease. Scorpius was at her side in mere seconds, accepting it while looking all around her much like he'd searched for the missing letter. Right. Hermione led him away from the chatter in the living room and into her office. Theo remained in the doorway while she took a seat, half expecting him to explore, but Scorpius never left her side, biting his bottom lip and showing the apprehension he never had to hide, at least not with her. Still, she stopped breathing when he opened his mouth, only exhaling when Scorpius seemed to change his mind, signaling one word. Father. Just as she thought. "Your dad is fine." Hermione straightened his bow tie and tied his shoes, which looked ready to come undone. When she finished, she rested her hands on her knees. "He went to help with—" "The loud noises," Theo supplied from the door. They both turned to him and then back to each other. "Yes, exactly that." Worry etched itself in his brows, and he signed a few words that gave her an idea of what he was feeling. Loud, scared, father. He signed a few colors, which had to mean Teddy, something that ordinarily would have made her chuckle, but she couldn't laugh when Scorpius appeared stressed. He couldn't figure out how to translate his next concerns, and was clearly getting frustrated, judging from the color beginning to bloom on his cheeks. He settled on pointing at her, and Hermione just knew. She guided him closer. "I'm fine. See?" She held out her arms. "Not a mark. We're all fine. Did you see Teddy?" He nodded, still flustered. "I know. It was really loud. Did you cover your ears?" Scorpius bobbed his fist. "Yes." "Teddy did too. I'm glad you were inside when the noise started." She couldn't imagine Scorpius seeing the dark mark. Just the thought of it made her shudder. To address his other sign, Hermione took his hands again. "You know, it's okay to be scared. I was scared. There are other scared people too, so your dad and Harry went to make sure everyone is safe." She smoothed her thumbs over his brow and flattened the lines that spoke of his concern much louder than he could express at that present moment. "He asked me to stay with you until he comes back." That brightened his spirits slightly, but his smiles didn't reach his eyes. "We could read more of Winnie the Pooh before Catherine tucks you in for the night." Scorpius looked away, towards the door where Theo remained, but he came back with a bashful yet hopeful request. "You." Hermione couldn't say no. The Malfoy home, with its clean lines and neutral tones, was still devoid of ornamentation, still a furnished dwelling that lacked anything people imbued with sentiment. Actually, no, that wasn't completely true. Not anymore. Signs of life had been there for weeks, but tonight Hermione saw how the addition of people further changed the feel of the room. Where there had been a chill, now there was warmth. Conversation took the place silence had once held firm in its grasp. Still stilted in some moments, but fluid in others. Friction and strife were fading, making way for the thin cords of reconciliation to form. Harmony, reconnection, rebirth. It was quite a sight to witness and an energy to feel. The remaining guests were arranged in the living room. The two sisters sat in the middle of Pansy and Daphne, who were on opposite sides of the sofa looking on. Theo had a chair, and Hermione took the armchair. Dean had taken Holly home when she started to get fussy, and Ginny had gone to Ron's. He would keep her company while she waited for Harry to return. Hermione wouldn't be surprised if Percy or George found their way over here to wait with them. It was the Weasley way. Conversation was as scattered as Hermione's thoughts. From Narcissa's right, Pansy listened to the stories the sisters exchanged about the lighter points of their childhood, both content in a way Hermione had never seen either woman before. Daphne seemed torn between listening, keeping an eye on Scorpius, and talking to Theo, but Andromeda's understanding hand on her knee kept her grounded. She knew how difficult tonight was for her, understood and appreciated her presence. It was evidence of the shades of gray that needed to be sorted. One night wouldn't be enough to heal every wound. One dinner wouldn't be enough to pick out the debris and clear the clutter. But today was about reconnection and acknowledgement. That work could start tomorrow. But for now, Scorpius didn't sit still. He proudly showed off the cactus, his expression only turning defensive when Theo appeared too thoughtful about its presence and didn't immediately say hello like everyone else. From there, he vacillated between making sure his dad hadn't arrived, watching in fascination as his cousin tried changing his nose into various animal snouts, and showing his favorite books to Daphne, the first of which was a children's dictionary. Its appearance made Theo hide a smile that caused Scorpius to squint suspiciously, but then he reassured his godson that he wasn't teasing. It earned him a tentative offer to look at the prized possession. Theo accepted, looking surprised by the boy who had been forced to take his hand not too long ago. Hermione smiled as the two studied the other for a long, blinking moment, highly amused that the unflappable, omniscient Theo had been temporarily discombobulated by a 5-year-old. After finishing with the dictionary, Scorpius joined Teddy at the coffee table on his knees where he showed his older cousin how the drawing parchment worked. Albus had already drawn a picture, if Teddy's laugh meant anything. When Scorpius offered his cousin a marker to draw back, Hermione looked up to find a few sets of curious eyes on her. She excused herself to the kitchen for a glass of wine. It was a decent enough idea after such an eventful day. Theo appeared just as she poured herself a glass. She already knew a conversation was about to happen, and decided to pour him one as well. Easy silence was broken in record time. "I suppose we owe the success of tonight to you." "I just provided the space." Stretching her neck from side to side, Hermione rolled her shoulders, showing the first signs of tiredness. "They did the rest." "You have a tendency to downplay your role in things." Theo leaned back on the counter. "For example, I could say that Scorpius has changed drastically, even in just the last month, and you would say, it's not just my doing. I just care about him, I know. You're even willing to fight for him." Hermione tensed, but maintained a calm expression under her observation. Of course, she had several questions about how he'd found out, and for once in his life, Theo offered information. She doubted it was free. Nothing ever was when he was scheming, like now. "Draco unintentionally hinted at it a few days ago." Theo sipped his wine, his face scrunching in distaste before he swallowed and set the glass down like it was offensive. "How?" "In conversation." Theo's sarcasm was almost as annoying as his silence. "You managed a feat I thought was impossible as Draco clings to perceived detachment. I've also not seen him so—" He trailed off while eyeing the second bottle to decide if he wanted to try that instead. "So what?" Hermione was nothing if not incurably curious. "How are things going now?" Of course he didn't answer her question, leading the conversation down another track. "Better, I imagine, since you two seem unified." She dissected his word choice and didn't like what she found in the implication. "I suppose we are considering we formed something of an alliance." "An alliance?" Theo's tone was calm in a lecturing sort of way. "Those are usually created to forge a bond and or work together to serve each other's side interest. What are your mutual interests?" "Obviously both Narcissa and Scorpius, mutually and individually. He's helping. He's stepping in. I've been trying to get him to do this since they moved back to England, but he's always continued on in the same manner he handles all of his matters. Yet you've managed to change it after one argument." Theo settled on the wine he wanted and uncorked it with ease before he set it down to let the wine breathe. "What did you say to him?" "Things I'll never repeat. Things I've apologized for because I spoke without fully understanding." Hermione glanced at Scorpius, who was watching Teddy draw. There was a familiar intrigue and shrewdness she saw when he was learning new things. "I have some regrets, but not many." Andromeda and Narcissa were looking on as well. The former wore a soft smile, while the latter's attention was split between the drawing and Scorpius, who was holding every marker like the good little assistant he was. His keen eyes were softening as the pictures took form, a growing smile replacing his look of concentration. But when he caught his grandmother looking, he instantly shut down, sat straighter, and stiffened. Hermione forgot about Theo's presence as she tried to catch Scorpius's eye, but it didn't work. That's vaguely similar to the answer I got from him. What? She was distracted. Oh, well, Malfoy, I find it amusing that you both continue to refer to the other by their surname. The force of habit that I understand no more than I understand him. She left Theo's side and went to sit on the stool on the other side of the island. Theo glanced at his watch. His wine needed more time to breathe, so he joined her, taking another stool to continue their conversation. Teddy glanced over at his cousin and turned his hair the exact shade of green as the cactus, which perked Scorpius up a bit, but not enough to relax him. Understanding someone, are we about to have another one of your cryptic dichotomy of man conversations? Hermione sighed, then shook her head, trying to clear the agitation that was beginning to swell in her veins. Do you want this to be that sort of discussion? Theo gave her an exploratory look she didn't appreciate at all. If we were, I would say that you believe you don't understand Draco when, in certain ways, you seem to have a better grasp on him than even I do. I doubt that. To understand someone is to know their nature, and to know their nature is to see the parts of them that mean the most, see into their heart. Her stomach twisted uncomfortably. She had seen the shape of Malfoy's heart once. It was both tattooed on his arm and placed in her care tonight. Suddenly Hermione was no longer thirsty, despite her mouth being dry. They observed the scene in the living room in ritualistic silence. Teddy, who appeared to be concentrating hard enough for his hair to settle into turquoise, finished his drawing, looking proud. Scorpius seemed okay enough, if a little muted. Daphne had even started to notice a frown forming. He scanned the room until he found her, and Hermione turned fully in order to sign a question she'd caught him early on. Are you okay? Scorpius raised his fist. Yes. A part of her didn't believe him. Just a twinge of that disbelief made her try again. Despite the fact that Narcissa had picked up on their little conversation, Andromeda as well. Hermione ignored all the eyes and brought her curved fingers to her chest to pat twice. Nervous? Yes. She had an idea about why, but she didn't press because he signed another word that made Hermione glance at her watch and take notice of the hour. Tired. Catherine's timing was impeccable. She came down the stairs, but was flummoxed to see more people than expected. As a nanny, she was used to being in the background, and was apologetic about her interruption. She remained closer to the cactus than she was to the group. It's time for Scorpius's bath, and then bedtime. Ah! Narcissa checked the time as well. So it is. Scorpius, it is time to say good night. Obediently, he got to his feet. As he wished each person a good night, it was clear Scorpius was operating based on set expectations. Scorpius waved at Teddy, who turned his hair navy like the night sky. He was as polite with a charmed Andromeda as he would have been with any adult, skirted around Pansy's teasing, and bowed politely to his grandmother in a way that made Hermione tense with memories. Daphne tensed too until Scorpius left Narcissa's side and stood in front of her. His eyes were fixed on her, much like earlier. They hugged and counted the days until their next visit. Hermione's emotions swelled, and she blinked back tears. When he finished saying good night to his aunt, Scorpius looked at Catherine, who nodded and smiled, before he approached Hermione and Theo. Day by day, Catherine's understanding of him was improving. It was endearing to witness, comforting even, that he had another ally, one willing to learn and change and grow. How are you? Hermione asked. Fine, Miss Granger. She seemed surprised by the question. I didn't realize there were people here. I would have waited, but he has lessons in the morning. You're fine, Hermione assured her with a smile. He's tired after an eventful day. Your timing couldn't be better. Catherine looked relieved, and they both glanced over to Scorpius and Theo, who were once again staring at each other. He didn't seem to know what his godfather expected of him, but he was saved from the silence when Theo spoke up. Good night, Scorpius. He signed it back in return. Theo appeared to be committing the action to memory, his eyes following the little boy as he returned to his nanny's side after sneaking Hermione a shy look. Don't you want to say good night to Miss Granger? Oh, it's fine. I promised to read him a bedtime story. She would say her good night to him then. How long does it take to get him ready for bed? Half an hour at least. Okay. Just come and get me, and I'll grab the book from his father's office. Conversation never resumed after the two went upstairs. Daphne left, citing Holly as feeding time. Everyone saw her off, and Hermione quietly noted the parting look between her and Narcissa wasn't as brittle. It was still decent out, if a little dark, and those remaining went outside for a breath of fresh air, protected by the wards of the home. Teddy tagged along. Once they were alone, Theo poured himself wine. The first taste didn't make him react so viscerally. He must not have hated it. They both drank in silence that seemed long, but in fact was not. How long have you been teaching Scorpius sign language? A month. Theo nodded. Makes sense. Oh? To adapt is to learn, and to learn is to grow. He finished his glass with little fanfare. I suppose we're all going to have to do both in order to understand him. What? Hermione didn't have any expectations of Theo as they pertained to Scorpius's communication, because she had never thought to add him to the equation. Not to be... I don't understand why you're surprised. He is my godson, after all. The reminder wasn't needed. It was a link Hermione thought about. Not often, but the glaring missing piece mocked her. She was about to start down that path when Andromeda returned to retrieve her glass of water, and apparently spotted them together, changing course. Theo! She wore a pleasant smile that reminded Hermione of her sister. I don't think I've had a moment to speak to you all evening. How have you been? Well, thank you. A beat passed as the two observed each other. Silent words exchanged. Theo inclined his head, picked up his wine, and excused himself, leaving Hermione with Andromeda alone. She waited until the door was closed before she gave her a look. My opinion on him for you hasn't changed. He's still a no. Hermione waved her off. No, that's over and done. He and I were discussing Scorpius, but I'll confess, I've always been curious about why you were so against him. He's emotionally unavailable. Simply stated, it raised far more questions about how the pieces connected and what Andromeda knew. Hermione wanted to delve into the matter head first, but never got the chance. You were discussing Scorpius. Teddy adores him, wants to show him everything. Her smile matched Hermione's growing one. That feeling was familiar. He's also quite attached to you, I see. He defers to you even over his father and grandmother. You did well to steer him to Draco's direction, but traditionally, I know. Hermione knew all about tradition, but that wasn't on her mind then. Nor was their audience or Narcissa's probing. She thought only of a father and son, and the bridge being built between them. It was instinct. I see. Andromeda folded her arms. There's much I still need to learn about them, but I do appreciate the opportunity you've given Teddy and I. Thank you. I only provided the space. You and Malfoy did the hard part by meeting to coordinate this. Draco! Andromeda exhaled his name like a difficult equation she'd spent days trying to solve. Likely not far from the truth. Hermione quietly empathized by leaning against her friend. Months had passed since their first conversation, but despite the strides they'd made as of late, in some ways, Hermione still felt like she was back at the beginning. Working, searching, and mining her way into him. Yes, she'd unearthed bits and pieces, but what she'd found hadn't yet taken shape. He's a puzzle I'm learning to sort. Well, I'm still looking for all the pieces, but Hermione... Her name was so soft it was nearly a whisper, one she almost missed. When she looked, the older woman rested a gentle hand on her cheek. It felt like comfort, like something a mother would do to her child in a quiet moment. But her eyes were mapping Hermione's face, searching until she found something. She smiled ruefully. He will be the hardest lesson you'll ever learn. Andromeda's parting words remained long after she left. Scorpius was fighting valiantly, but by the time Hermione sat down to read, he was yawning and blinking blearily in order to stay awake. He leaned against her arm, heavy with determination, to look on as she read. He turned to the first page before rubbing his eyes again. Such a stubborn boy. Hermione thought fondly, smiling at the top of his head. She read each word with care, taking time to drag her finger under the letters as she sounded out the story, but she didn't make it through the second page before his eyes grew too heavy to fight on. Sleep called his name like warmth from a fire on a cold night. There was no other choice but to answer its call. For several minutes, Hermione held on, allowing him to settle, his breathing to deepen as he slipped further and further into dreamland. Quiet mumbles filled the scant space as he helped him lay down. Nothing he murmured was intelligible, just adorable sleeping noises that she responded to with gentle shushing of her own. Hermione tucked him in snugly, whispering her wishes for him to have a good night's sleep, while brushing the fringe off his forehead. After turning the lamp off, she left him to his dreams, turning towards the open door, where Narcissa was waiting. It wasn't surprising, but Hermione didn't jolt. Hand over her heart, she took a breath before approaching the woman. How long had she been there? There was no telling, and Narcissa didn't appear keen on answering any questions. Hermione joined her in the doorway. Everyone gone? Yes, not too long ago. Narcissa peered past her to the sleeping boy. I see he is asleep. He didn't make it far. Busy day. Narcissa seemed thoughtful in the silence that followed as they walked down the hall towards the living room. There were 2 cups of tea waiting for them. Her first taste revealed that Narcissa hadn't made it herself. Chamomile and lavender. It was close to her preference, but not quite right. Andromeda. I would like for you to accept my hospitality and remain here tonight. Hermione inhaled, nearly choking, but she swallowed a mouthful of warm tea instead. After recovering, she cleared her throat, ready to reject the offer. Miss Granger, might I remind you that there are aurors combing the woods around your home, and more stationed outside your wards? Narcissa was a little too prepared, suspiciously so. I both insist and Her eyes lit up as if she were remembering an important part. I am not leaving any room for argument. Well, that was a very pansy thing to say. I see. Hermione ran through several scenarios on how to get out of this, but the odds weren't favorable. Even without Theo's shrewd attention to detail, Pansy was good at making effective backup plans, namely, Ginny, or her lectures. Narcissa looked on, her smile growing wider as Hermione's options diminished. She sipped her tea like she knew she'd already won, or had a hidden piece up her sleeve. Best to live to fight another day. I'll have to return home for clothes. No need. Narcissa placed the tea on her saucer. Pansy was a dear and brought you everything you would need. She left them for you in the guest room. Last room at the end of the hall, upstairs. How fortunate. Narcissa's smirk made her look far younger, far less serious than Hermione had ever seen her. She seemed relaxed. But then her smile faded. I would like to thank you for your help. You're welcome. Hermione would do it all again if it led to a night like tonight, dark mark aside. Your sister and son were instrumental in making it happen. Which brings up my topic of discussion. Narcissa crossed her legs at the ankles and placed her hands in her lap. I have made some observations this evening. I am glad that you are staying so that we might discuss them further. It wasn't her tone but her informal body language that put Hermione on high alert. Regardless of how well the evening had gone, Narcissa Malfoy was not a casual woman. Acceptable, yes. Observant, definitely. But never, ever casual. Hermione recalled every strange look, every moment she'd begun to speak, but didn't, and the increasingly thoughtful expressions in Scorpius's direction. Narcissa's silence had more to do with her biding time than anything else. Hermione thought of every possible excuse for her actions, examined them, and then sighed. She wasn't in the mood. Perhaps this can wait until tomorrow? No, it cannot. Narcissa's answer was firm. I would rather speak while this is fresh in my mind. Fair enough. Her memory was no longer guaranteed, and that made Hermione even less keen on discussing anything, but she knew Narcissa would never leave it be. We don't have a great history of pleasant debates or friendly chats. Hermione finished her tea and placed the empty cup on its saucer. Chamomile and lavender, calming teas. Narcissa was prepared. She must have been planning this talk for a while, and tonight's events likely provided the perfect opportunity to set the stage. It didn't make her feel any better, just caught off guard, which Hermione hated. No, we do not. Narcissa coolly looked her in the eyes. But I believe we have made enough progress that I can speak to you freely. You've never been one to mince words. Touché, Miss Granger, but I have observed your relationship with my grandson over the past couple months, and I believe that it has reached a point where I must intervene. If I have overstepped, I will not deny that your presence has been good for Scorpius. I've encouraged it because I believe you are the key to him speaking again. That wasn't as surprising as it should have been. However, I think you should be careful. Narcissa's voice dipped low with warning. Seeing you with him has made me double down on my efforts to implore Draco to see reason. He needs to remarry, and he will. And when he does, Scorpius will have a new mother. There will be no place for you, at least not in the capacity you are in now. There was a slight twinge of discomfort in her chest, but Hermione swallowed it down and gathered her thoughts. There's a saying, it takes a village to raise a child. She looked down at her hands. If his father does remarry, I'll become a part of that village. He will always have my support. Narcissa accepted the answer with a polite nod. Foolish. Hermione thought that was the end. It was not. Earlier, when he and Daphne did this bizarre thing where he was counting days until the next time they see each other, Hermione nearly started bouncing her knee, but she knew that would only aggravate Narcissa enough to correct her behavior. In rebellion, she adjusted herself to mirror the woman next to her. "Did you teach him how to do this?" "Yes." "Why?" "The death of his mother, your rigid treatment and structure, and the distance his father is working to close. That combination has created a child who isn't fond of change." Hermione felt heavy from her own words. "Scorpius needs routine and consistency, in addition to reassurance, security, and a firm anchor. He gets anxious when he doesn't know something or he doesn't understand. This is why we count days." "I don't understand." Narcissa's disconnection from the needs of those she sought to protect was something Hermione found troublesome, but she didn't want to explain it any further. Narcissa was a patient. There was a level of professionalism expected of her that couldn't be achieved as she proceeded, because the matter of Scorpius was personal. "I can't make you understand his needs. I can only explain the way I see things. But then do so, Miss Granger." Hermione inhaled slowly, then exhaled in a rush, closing her eyes, gathering her thoughts so that she wouldn't go off the rails like last time. She wanted to remain calm, clear. "I've found that losing someone makes you hold on to the others a little tighter. You haven't talked to him about your illness, but Scorpius knows something isn't right. He's far more observant than you may think, and cognizant enough to know that there's a real possibility he'll be left behind again." He wasn't wrong about that, sadly enough. "There are no guarantees in this life, Narcissa. You know this just as I do." Hermione looked down, feeling heavier with each uttered word. "Sometimes people leave and don't come back. I believe Scorpius knows this because of his mother, and I think that this is the root of his anxiety. It might even be the reason he shut himself off and chose silence. He doesn't count the days with me." Not with Malfoy either, but Hermione kept that to herself because Scorpius already had an odd routine with him. Daily notes, visits to his office. It had grown to breakfast, another hand to reach for, sign language. Tomorrow, yes. There was improvement on that front, and a willingness on Malfoy's part to set the tone of acceptance while allowing Scorpius to dictate the development. He would warm to his father in his own way, at his own speed, with little brave steps and small poignant moments. But Narcissa wanted things done her way, at her pace and in her time. She was limited in that respect. She wanted Scorpius to talk more than she wanted to deal with the reasons for his silence. Wanted him to be normal when the word alone was nothing more than an illusion. There was no routine with his grandmother that didn't involve bowing and standing at attention. The image of perfection and propriety. Nothing inspired him to seek her out or make him look forward to their next interaction. Nor did he seem inclined to change that. At 5, Scorpius hadn't perfected the art of subtlety. He avoided her as much as he could and forgot about her presence until a look reminded him. The same one that killed his excitement earlier. It put him on edge and made him nervous that he wasn't doing things as she wanted him, and he'd been trained to do. Gods, there was so much Hermione wanted to say, so much criticism that it burned in her belly, but she refused to set it free, leaving her with nothing to offer in substitute, so the air remained heavy with implications, laced between Narcissa's vocal realization. Adjustments had been made, that much Hermione would credit her for, but change involved more than acting before being challenged. It was more than the series of tweaks she had made to her treatment of Scorpius. While better, there was work to be done if she truly wanted to get somewhere with him, or her son. Narcissa stood and crossed the room to the window, where the cactus sat just a little taller than before. Her fingers grazed the spines, much like her son's had weeks ago in his office. Facing away from Hermione, she abruptly pulled back her hand and wrapped it around her middle. A shuddering breath escaped her as the silence stretched on. "Do you think Scorpius will remember me when I am gone?" The vulnerability in her voice doused the flames of annoyance Hermione had been battling. Pain. It weighed heavy on the equation. She opened her mouth, but an answer never came. Narcissa straightened to her full height with a cool resignation, an eerie acceptance of what was to come, and what she had already lost along the way. I can't say for certain," Hermione forced out. I'm no expert on children, but he's young. The memories you create with him will be his to keep." "That's not exactly comforting." Narcissa's dry, rueful chuckle prickled at Hermione's ears. "In an attempt to prepare for the inevitable, I will admit I have been rather hard on him. Hard enough to drive him away. Enough for him to seek you first in everything. I suppose his fear of me is my fault in the end." "I don't think he's afraid of you, per se, only not meeting your expectations of perfection. He doesn't like making mistakes, but Scorpius isn't just obedient and smart. He's forgiving. It will take time and work, but you'll have to want it too." Narcissa said nothing. "It's not about if he remembers you. It's about how. He'll associate little things with you. Your scent, the way he feels when you hug him, the texture of your hair, the feel of your hand in his when he's feeling lost or scared or even happy. Those moments can be stronger than memories." Hermione allowed her words to marinate, but not for too long. "You're capable of being memorable. You've been crafting your legacy for years now. It's time to do the same with Scorpius, while you still can. Just as you've encouraged my son to do." Narcissa finally turned around, and Hermione was too restless to remain seated. "Perhaps." She treaded carefully as she entered the dangerous waters of this conversation, drifting towards the vortex. "He needs to know how to care for him in order to prepare for the time when you can't. Or he could get serious about contracting a wife in order to give Scorpius the proper mother he needs. I have been trying for months and still nothing. No woman interests him." Putting the pieces together of their complicated relationship would have been easier, and she should have done it earlier. But here Hermione was, calling forth everything she'd learned, the statements he'd made, and things she tucked away for further analysis. Now was the time. Hermione used the silence to run through it all. Words from Theo, lessons from Daphne, and comments from Pansy. The combination made sense of the friction between Malfoy and his mother. It wasn't that Narcissa was pushing him to marry. It was that she hadn't once bothered to consider anything as it pertained to him. How was he doing? Was he ready? Did it matter? Hermione saw the way women reacted to Malfoy, witnessed how they schemed and fell over each other just for a moment of his time and the attention he didn't give. He didn't seem to want it or their flirty ways, didn't want to be locked in a tank or put into the cage of another marriage. But that was exactly what his mother was forcing on him. His refusal to do it should have made her compassionate and understanding, but it hadn't. And that just... remarriage is his decision, and ultimately not one you can make for him. That was not exactly what Hermione had intended to say, but it was too late, and the words were already out in the universe. Worse still, Hermione heard the edge in her own voice. So did Narcissa. There was no stopping now. If you're interested in fixing things with your son, you should respect his wishes and take note of his refusal and give him the chance to make his own choices about how he should live his life. Because ultimately, when you're gone, he will have to live on. Let him breathe, Narcissa. Let him grieve. Let him get to know his son on his terms. You only need to support him. All she could think about was the relief on Malfoy's face earlier, when Scorpius had reached for his hand. At one point, he had to have thought all hope was lost. Still, he kept trying anyway. Hermione looked away and bit her lip. Scorpius wasn't the only one who lost someone. He keeps taking hit after purebloods do not marry for love, Miss Granger. She had heard that time and time again. Didn't you love Lucius? Narcissa wore his ring, after all, not out of duty, but sentiment. She sought her own comfort in his hallucinations. If not for love, then what? When we married, I barely knew him outside of our families and school. Narcissa brought her hand to her necklace. I had my duties to my family, especially when... Andromeda chose love over family. To answer your question, Miss Granger, I did love him because I chose to. She looked off, eyes vacant, but there was a passion in her voice Hermione had never heard. It rendered Hermione incapable of ignoring. I nurtured that love. It took time and patience, trust and constant strength throughout the hardest of times, especially then, but it grew into something fierce, something encompassing that you wouldn't understand. Hermione exhaled the breath she had been holding. No, I wouldn't. I know you think my ways are cold, but love is not impossible in matches such as these. Draco could have that, if he allowed it. You don't know that. I just don't understand how you could contract his marriage so soon after Astoria's death. It's like repotting a plant too soon. You'll shock the roots. It'll die. I survived. You're different. Hermione folded her hands and steeled herself. That was not how she imagined this conversation going. Feared, maybe, but she'd hoped otherwise. Miss Granger, you operate under the assumption that I do not know my son. It's not an assumption. You don't. And you do? Does it matter? The fact that he keeps refusing has to mean something. She looked at Hermione as though she were ignorant. Maybe she was. Whether Draco likes it or not, this is how we have operated for generations. He continued the tradition by marrying Astoria, and he will continue again by marrying his next wife. It is his duty, and he is nothing if not loyal to his family. Hermione was left with a bad taste in her mouth. I made my choice long ago. Draco has made his for the future of our line. I'm at least giving him an opportunity to pick from an array of suitable witches this time. I was never afforded the choice. This is in no way my business, but you're deluded if you think you've given him a choice. Before Narcissa could part her lips to speak, Hermione raised a hand, breathing deeply in an attempt to contain her indignation. You said it yourself. You want him to marry, and you're willing to contract it to make it happen. That's not giving him a choice. That's giving him an ultimatum. Sometimes I am faced with hard decisions. I am just doing what is necessary. It cannot be alone. She touched her temple. One day Draco will understand that this was all for him. No, he won't. Hermione shook her head, getting more and more worked up. You're still trying to prune Malfoy into the shape of a man you think he should be, something proper and acceptable for the society he hates, rather than allowing him to grow organically. You're fighting against nature itself. If nothing else, the fractured state of your relationship is a sign that you're not winning. Just as your way isn't working for Scorpius, it isn't working for him. It was evident that the conversation had run its course, but Hermione wasn't finished. He's given up the opportunity to find his own happiness once. Now that he's alone, you want him to do it again. I'm in no way his advocate, but what more do you want from him, Narcissa? She closed her eyes, not liking the way emotions made her voice strain. Hasn't he sacrificed enough? Silence greeted her question as a response. The guest room is the last door on the end of the hall. Good night, Miss Granger. Narcissa inclined her head and walked towards a wing. She appeared at perfect ease, but there was tension in each step. She stopped at the table and cleared her throat in that Umbridge way that made all the hair on Hermione's arms stand on end. Then she turned slowly. Oh, and Miss Granger, one more thing. There was false politeness in her tone. What is it? You mentioned that you are not advocating for my son, which I suppose is a good thing. She made a dry noise. How can you advocate for someone you choose not to call by name? Time was an agitating blur. Hermione wasn't certain how she ended up in Malfoy's office, but she paced off her excess energy there. When repetitive actions no longer worked, she busied herself in work, making headway in some of the translation interpretations and setting aside parts she didn't understand to send Percy for further analysis. Hermione read until her eyes were tired before putting it away for the night. Narcissa had long since gone to bed when she peeked in on Keating, who was filling out her report. She wasn't sleeping well again, and had come to her room upset, but had already forgotten the reason by the time Keating had asked. Hermione wondered if her slowly increasing memory incidents were the beginning of the shift into the next phase of her disease. But for now, all they could do was continue to monitor it. And Hermione told Keating just that before she found her way to the guest room. Pansy had left a bag of clothes, more than enough for one night. Hermione frowned, but changed into comfortable attire before returning to the living room to read Persuasion in preparation for Pansy's Regency-themed birthday party. Or wait up for Malfoy. Semantics. An hour turned into 2. 2 turned into 3. Hermione made more progress than she had in the last month, which likely had little to do with her ability to speed read, and more to do with the fact that she was out of her element. In a completely different environment, she couldn't tackle her ever-present to-do list. A change in location really could bring a change in how one felt. Instead of being confused about the nearly blank canvas surrounding her, Hermione appreciated it for what it was. The lack of distraction, an addition of peace, felt nice when her duties weren't ordering themselves in her mind. It was after midnight, hour 4, when she heard someone on the stairs. Looking over, Hermione spotted a bleary-eyed Scorpius at the bottom step, holding onto the railing as he looked around. His eyes fell on her, but then moved along. He kept looking. "He's not back yet." The little boy frowned, looking more and more nervous as he approached her. Wrinkled from sleep, Scorpius had an intense case of bedhead that could not be tamed. He looked so pitiful standing there that Hermione came up with an idea. "Did you know that Albus loves the stars?" "Yes," Scorpius signed. Though the confusion remained on his face, he rubbed his eyes. "I'll summon my bag and show you why. Then I'll tell you a story." Hermione picked up her wand off the table and flicked it. Scorpius startled when her bag flew over his head and into her waiting hand. He looked on as she rifled through years of oddities she toted around. She never knew when something might be of use. Fascinated, he watched her entire arm disappear, followed by her head, as she shifted around until she found what she was looking for and pulled it out. Placing the circular projector on the coffee table, she turned it on, and smiled when it lit up, charmed to run on magic. When he saw nothing, Scorpius looked mildly disappointed. "Let me get everything set up." Hermione made quick work of turning off the kitchen lights and shutting the blinds, knowing moonlight would still filter through. Before she turned out all the lights in the living room, she returned to her reclined spot on the sofa and lifted the blanket in invitation for him to crawl in with her. It was an offer he quickly accepted. It didn't take much adjusting for them to get comfortable on the sofa together, with Scorpius, happy and comfortable, curled up at her side. "Are you ready?" He still appeared puzzled, but ultimately trusted her. Hermione used that and turned off the lights. The projector transformed the ceiling into a velvety black nighttime sky dotted with thousands of tiny stars. Not perfectly dark, thanks to the moonlight, but she could make out the shapes and the little boy next to her. She heard his audible gasp. Her heart pounded at the small sound. It was only a projection, but it was a beautiful sight. Hermione was transported to the pasture outside of her house. It was a clear night, a perfect one, and she looked to the sky in order to reconnect with the earth. She hadn't done this in quite some time. The sky hadn't looked much different than this when she had taken Albus outside during one of his earliest visits. He had been sullen and restless, much like the little boy next to her now. "Sometimes," Hermione said, barely above a whisper, "when I feel nervous or scared, when everything feels too big and I'm worried, I look to the sky and breathe." She did just that, inhaling, and she both heard and felt him do the same. Hermione exhaled slowly, listening as he mimicked her. The projector and the moon illuminated them enough for her to see the wonder in Scorpius's blue eyes. "The sky makes me feel better, and the stars give me a sense of peace. I feel stronger. They remind me that no matter what worries me, everything will be okay." Hermione watched as he closed his eyes and took another deep breath. It felt as if he had absorbed her words. She did the same with an affection so great it threatened to spill over. They relaxed together while staring at the projected sky. Next time, maybe on a different night, when it wasn't overcast or smoggy, she would do this again, with him under the endless sky behind her home. Shifting to her side, Hermione propped her head on her bent arm to get comfortable. It jogged her memory about a story she owed him. She could only think of one. "You're named after the stars, Scorpius." Finding the constellation, she raised her wand and connected the stars on the projection with a line drawn from magic. "The Scorpion." Hermione did the same with the next constellation. "This one is Orion." He settled more comfortably at her side, pulling the blanket up to his throat. "There are many versions of their story, so I'll tell you my favorite one, the child-friendly one. Orion was a fearless hunter." Hermione told the story from memory. "So great that he vowed to kill every animal on Earth." Another tiny gasp made her absently run fingers through his bedhead with her free hand. "I know. Animals are precious, so Gaia, the goddess of Earth and protector of the animals, asked Scorpio, a giant scorpion, to stop Orion. Scorpio stung him with his stinger to make him stop, and as a reward for his bravery, Gaia placed Scorpio in the night sky." The silence following the story was peaceful, though short. "Whenever you feel nervous or scared," Hermione spoke gently, still patting down his hair, "whenever you feel worried, like you can't, remember that you're just as brave as the scorpion you're named after, just as strong." His hand found hers, and she held on as the silence stretched wider than the expanse of the projected sky. Hermione felt no need to speak, no need to explain things further, or even begin telling another story. She just relaxed in the peaceful quiet surrounding them, noting the precise moments Scorpius' breathing changed, when he relaxed and when he fell back asleep. Completely so. Apparently this was all he needed to relax his mind back to dreamland. When he brought his other thumb to his mouth, Hermione didn't correct it. She let him sleep. He was tired. And so was she. The next time Hermione opened her eyes, the world was a warm, hazy fog of confusion and past time. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. But everything slowly crept into focus. It took several blinks for her to put the pieces together where she was. More still to determine how she wound up so warm and with a crick in her neck. Wedged on her side, the cushions were at her back. Then she realized Scorpius was at her front, gripping the arm that she had wrapped around him. Expanding her range of focus, confusion rolled in like a fog, clouding her mind, already heavy with sleep. The lights were dim, and in front of her were legs covered in gray trousers. Hermione inclined her head, and there was Malfoy. Oh. Normally impeccable, he looked a bit worn around the edges. His tie was undone but not removed. There was a large bruise on the side of his neck that seemed to continue under the collar of his shirt to the shoulder he favored. Exactly how long had he been there? Hermione had no idea, but it couldn't have been long. After all, she couldn't determine which one of them was more confused to see the other. "What happened to your face?" she asked groggily. "What time is it?" "Just before 3, Malfoy replied in a low tone so as not to disturb Scorpius. A moment passed as they both watched him sleep on, undisturbed, with his thumb still in his mouth. He didn't answer the first question, only took a knee next to the sofa. "Why isn't he in bed?" Hermione felt like an intruder as she looked on while Malfoy brushed his son's hair from his forehead. The move was as reflexive as breathing. There was something soft in the set of his bruised jaw. If she didn't know any better, she might have called the serenity and the silence of the moment with the sun happiness. It only lasted a second, but the memory would be burned in her mind, not easily forgotten. "He came down looking for you. I was reading." Hermione covered her yawn with a fist. "I showed him the sky with my projector and told him a story to ease him back to sleep. It worked for both of us, apparently." That only seemed to perplex him further, but he said nothing more on the topic. "He'll be glad to see you when he wakes." He was worried. Hermione summoned every bit of her willpower and tried not to look, but even that wasn't enough. Rooted to the spot, she was trapped under a gaze that moved fluidly between her and Scorpius. But when the moment stretched too long, when the look in his eyes began shifting to something that made her warm, Hermione focused on the grounding force between them. Scorpius. "We should get him to bed." "I can take him." Malfoy started to reach for his son, but winced. "Go take care of yourself first." She glanced at his bruised knuckles and followed the trail up his arm, down the side, noting the rip in his shirt. "I can get him to bed with the featherlight charm." Hermione did, but only about 20 minutes after Malfoy silently left. His expression a bizarre mixture of so many things. It was too late to try and decipher him. By the time he reappeared, she was stuffing the projector into her beaded bag along with her book. Malfoy lingered by the stairs, much like his son had earlier, but for all the similarities of their actions, there were differences as well. The first being that she'd actually heard Scorpius approach. He walked like a child, no attempt to cover his steps. He wasn't afraid of being heard. Nor was Malfoy, but the comparison ended there. He was no child, after all. A man in every sense of the word. His enigmatic energy made that detail hard to ignore and impossible to forget. Hermione easily could have returned to her task, but abandoned it to observe him instead. If only for a moment. If only to figure out why he was standing there. Malfoy's hair was wet from the shower he'd obviously just taken, parted and combed. He changed into his routine all black, but instead of trousers, he wore joggers that looked comfortable enough to sleep in, and a black long-sleeve shirt that had fit his frame nicely. Less like an undertaker and more normal. If the word could be used to describe a man like Draco Malfoy. "He's in bed." Hermione hadn't been able to disentangle Scorpius from her blanket, so she'd left that with him as well. "Good." Malfoy paused. Did he say anything after I was gone? No, but I have a sneaking suspicion that this wasn't his first time. That got Malfoy's attention. Before Albus left, he said that Scorpius liked being read to, but I didn't seriously consider the possibility. If I'd really thought about it, I would have realized sooner. How else would he know if Scorpius hadn't told him? Hermione finished putting everything in the bag and gave the man still standing at the stairs her full attention. I've been thinking about why he spoke to Teddy, but then I realized I shouldn't. We shouldn't push. He'll talk openly when he's ready, when he's relaxed and comfortable, when he feels more secure. Today just proved as much. Seems logical. We need to keep feeding his confidence and keep his routine stable. He thrives on structure, to a degree. If your goal is for him to speak, I'd prefer his trust over his voice. Hermione was rendered temporarily speechless by his honesty. It made her grasp for words to weave into something that made sense. Maybe you can have both. Shifting from one foot to the other, Hermione cracked her knuckles, noticing how Malfoy twitched, much like his mother at the act. Is there something you need? I'm about to go upstairs to bed. Bed? Ah, he didn't know. Your mother insisted I stay the night. Hermione cleared her throat. I believe there was a vote in my absence, as everything was coordinated before I finished reading Scorpius to sleep the first time. If you... No, it's fine. Our interrogation with your intruders is tomorrow afternoon. Also, there were sightings near your home. It would be prudent for you not to go home alone until we have someone clean his traceable signature from in front of your home. As of right now, it's like a homing beacon marking your house. It may take a few days to coordinate. But I'm not arguing with you tonight. Malfoy sounded as irritated as he looked. The arm he favored remained carefully bent, while the other hand rubbed the back of his neck. When he moved, stopping just behind the sofa, his approach was as careful and guarded as his next words. I've managed to heal my neck. Not well, given the discolored skin from the mark that still lingered. She had seen it from across the room, but only now noticed how severe it was up close. Malfoy's hesitation was visible as she paused. My shoulder and side, however. He left it at that. He didn't ask as much as he gave her an opportunity to decline, or offer. The healer in her took over, gesturing in the direction of the kitchen. The lighting was better, more clinically appropriate. He chose the chair at the head of the table, turning it around completely before taking a seat. Naturally, Hermione brought her bag, rifling through it for everything she would possibly need. She sat each of them in a neat row before picking up her wand. You allowed me to have a full discussion with you while you were injured? Have you ever tried to shut yourself up? Malfoy asked dryly. Fair enough. Hermione rolled her eyes, mouth quirking. What happened? I was doing a perimeter check to make certain there were no Death Eaters lingering in Godric's Hollow when I was ambushed. Where was Harry? Concern and years of friendship, as well as her best friend's tendency to find trouble, even when he wasn't looking for it, made her ask. Is he unharmed? Malfoy's answer was crisp and cool as she examined the bruise on his neck that he'd already tried to heal. He was on the other side of the village, with the team doing the same canvassing. Relief bloomed in her chest. Then she realized something. Wait, you were alone? I work better that way. He remained placid, unrepentant as he stared straight ahead, jaw set, lips rigid. Swallowing her retort took a substantial amount of effort. She directed her attention to healing his wound, rather than clunking him over the head with the end of her wand for his stubbornness, even though it wasn't surprising. That wouldn't do anyone any good. Not only would Malfoy be irate, but she also have another wound to heal. Healer's oath and all. 2 healing charms later, and a bit of salve on the bruise forming under his jaw, and it was like it had never happened. Malfoy had blessedly remained silent after she'd started working in earnest. Next order of business. What curse did they use? Obviously nothing permanently damaging or deadly. Never mind that. If you don't remember... Hermione stepped back and made a gesture with her fingers. You'll need to take your shirt off. Excuse me? She pointed at the shoulder he was favoring. For your shoulder and your side. I need to see everything. I don't need to take my shirt off to... Your choice, really. Hermione folded her arms, wand clenched in her fist, appearing casual, if not a little bored. How am I supposed to see what's wrong in order to heal it? Which brought to the forefront another question. Theo said he sent a team of healers. He did, as well as the poisoning team for the members of the town's council who were trapped inside the building with the poison inside. They're all being treated, by the way. Good to know. But wait. Hermione snapped her mouth shut as she weighed her options, approaching the topic or retreating completely. The very idea that Malfoy would bypass healers on the scene that made no sense. It wasn't in her nature to let things lie, so she settled on something in between. Ignoring remnants of implication from his statement and the layers of meaning in between them, Hermione settled on one point. The easy point. I'm trying to decide if you're that stubborn or that stupid. You could have permanent injuries, yet here you are concerned about your modesty. Are you going to lecture me or heal me? Malfoy's voice was almost hoarse. I've been awake for over 24 hours, and I can lecture you with your clothes on. She leveled him with a glare. But if I'm to heal you, you'll have to take your shirt off so I'll know if I need potions, spells, salve, or a combination of all three. She held his gaze with a bold one of her own, until Malfoy rolled his eyes and slowly pulled his shirt up with his uninjured arm. The action wasn't natural, his movements careful as he revealed bare, scarred skin. The nasty gash was on his side, and a bare arm that should have looked different. It should have spoken of his present and future and the Scorpius constellation on the belly of the beast that she knew took up most of his arm. There's no need to glamour something I already know exists. If you're that ashamed, I'm not. Malfoy glared at her. It's frankly none of your business why I chose to glamour my skin. The inflection and tone his words carry spoke clearly of the personal nature behind his actions, though he wouldn't actually say anything. No, that would be too much like an admission. I don't owe you anything, not even an explanation. He was right, Hermione thought to herself, but it still grated on her nerves. It was likely because of her own reasons, which were rooted in selfish curiosity that hadn't been sated since her first glimpse. Curiosity, by definition, spoke to a desire for knowledge and understanding. That pursuit involved digging to unleash secrets and find the deeper meaning in the ordinary events, and in the ones that weren't quite so ordinary. Like the shirtless wizard in front of her, who stared back in heated defiance. The same man Hermione had been trying to understand for months. She hadn't pushed as hard as she could have, more concerned with his mother and distracted by his son, but she could no longer deny her intrigue with him. Hermione's eyes skimmed his skin, roaming across the definition of his muscled torso down to his waistband of his joggers. A quick aversion brought her attention to the light gash on his side. A flesh wound still fixed with a spell. That was easy. His shoulder was not. Can you sit up straighter? Hermione stepped forward when he did just that, eyes on her as she approached. Malfoy tried to stretch his arm out, but the left one wouldn't comply. His mouth parted in hissing wince before he brought the arm close. It was dislocated. Though an easy fix, he grunted in pain when she did so, even after counting to 3. He curled his hand into a tight fist, his face flushed as he bit down on his lip. Hermione checked to make certain it was back in place and nodded more to herself than him upon seeing that she'd been successful. Better? Much. Allowing her eyes to scan his body with clinical ease, an errant thought escaped how well built he was from all the swimming he did. Lean. Muscular. But Hermione banished the thought in favor of turning on her clinical blinders as she started lightly touching the area of his shoulder that still looked tender despite repair. Narcissa says you swim daily, sometimes more than once? That's correct. As she continued to prod, noting his shallow breathing, strain and tension corded in every muscle, all indicative of pain. I've seen this shoulder injured twice in 2 months. It was surprising for someone to swim with such an injury. The sport was hard on the shoulders. Repetition was an easy path to wear and tear. Do you mind if I... Go on. It took a few minutes, and a diagnostic charm that confirmed that his injury, which was under layers and layers of scar tissue, wasn't new at all, merely aggravated by the evening's ambush. His glamour hid the tattoo, but not the external evidence of the severity of his injury, the swelling and sensitive skin. You should stop until this clears up and scale it back. You're only making it worse. Trust me when I say your body will tell you when it's had enough. Malfoy said nothing at first, but his head turned towards her, and his eyes moved from her face to her hands where they touched him. She tapped a sore point, and he inhaled sharply, then exhaled a breath she felt against her shoulder despite the layer of clothes. Your seizure? Yes, an answer given as instinctively as her heartbeat, and just as unconsciously. Not that I remember. Taut silence swelled between them as they each held cautiously onto something personal, all the while waiting for the other to speak. Whether they wielded their knowledge like a weapon or something that deserved protection, Hermione wasn't sure. She didn't want to think about it. "Have you had another?" That was just as unexpected as his silent request for an answer was unfailingly clear. No. Words always came easier when the world was hushed and quiet, when it felt like nothing else existed. No expectations. Just an exchange of truth. The last time Hermione felt like this was the night they'd spent nearly 2 hours talking over wine and whiskey. The possibility is there, as is the potential for it to develop into a condition, but I know my limits now. "Do you?" His exasperated breath grabbed her attention. "You're involved, not just with my mother and Scorpius, but gardening, your work at the hospital, the brews you do for the wolves, and the restoration. Just to name a few, mind you. I know there are more. You make yourself available for everyone, but I'm not the only one. Not in this case. For me, there is an end date." The piercing look in Malfoy's eyes, combined with the private tone he was using to speak to her, put Hermione on edge. It made her itch to finish working so she could get some space from him, or at the very least stop noticing how clean he smelled. "Everything I do is done with selfish intent." He glanced down to where her hands had stilled on his warm skin. "The extent to which I stretch myself is exhausting, yes, but it is done with a goal in mind. It won't last forever. You can't say that, now can you? There will always be someone, a patient, a goal, a project. Always something that will bleed you dry." "I will do what I can for those I care about. I make no apologies for that." "And what do you get in return?" Caring for people isn't transactional. At last, Hermione stepped back and picked up the parchment that would have another look at the readings for his shoulder. "Have a little faith in people." "Only if you recognize that you don't know your limits as well as you think you do." "Don't tell me you're concerned." Hermione chuckled and rolled her eyes, folding the reading and putting them back into her bag. Malfoy searched her face before turning away, his legs brushing against hers as she returned to her task. Leaning in to take a closer look, her eyes roamed over the injured area before she touched the angry red skin, frowning when he winced. "I can't fix this. Not in one sitting. It'll take—" "I didn't ask you to fix it. I asked you to—" "Actually, you didn't ask me anything," Hermione reminded him. How long has your shoulder been like this?" All she could do was recall every interaction they had ever had, and not once did he seem injured in any way, except after the incident with Narcissa in the garden, and the botched raid when Theo had healed him. Which meant he knew. Not surprising. Someone as proud as Malfoy would carry the secret injury to his grave. And yet... "I injured it the night my father died." Malfoy seemed more than uncomfortable as he looked towards the living room. Tension rolled off of him in waves, growing, then compressing in a way that made Hermione roll her own shoulders in relief. "We fought off the first wave of Death Eaters, but when the second came, I was already injured. My father made my mother take me, and he called for the oars." She knew what happened after that. The battle, the carnage, the flames that still consumed the manor. While his mother had written a detailed account of their escape in her book, Hermione got the impression Malfoy had never spoken of it. It simply wasn't in his nature. Pansy wore her bruises proudly, gracefully, and unapologetically, but Malfoy hid his like a lone wolf. For safety, survival. Hermione touched his glamoured arm, just lower than the still-forming bruise, a gentle touch that brought his attention back to her. Her pulse picked up, and though natural instinct told her to back up or look away, her brain reminded her that she had a job to do. "You've been carrying this all this time." Through the Auror Academy, where an injury like this would have eliminated him from contention. Years of rigorous wear and tear with little care. He even carried Scorpius with that arm. The pain should have been constant, yet he always appeared unaffected. "What potions are you taking, and how much?" "Nothing for pain. I'm used to it." Hermione jabbed the skin hard, which made Malfoy swear violently, his gray eyes murderous. She met his strong reaction with a simple shrug. "Doesn't seem like it to me." "Granger!" "I know a bit about healing these sorts of injuries, but it's more Susan's specialty. That being said, this is treatable, with the right sort of magic and care, but you won't ask for the help you so clearly need." "I've managed this long." "You have, but once again, why suffer needlessly when all you have to do is ask?" Hermione put medicinal salve on his inflamed skin and watched as the magic soothed it. It would only work so much. Anything more would have to be done from the inside out, with charms and magic he didn't want to use because to do so would cause him to reveal more than he was ready to show. Don't tell me you believe you're meant to suffer for the things you've done. And what would you say if I did? I'd say that it's clear you're trying to atone, but more importantly, you're not defined by your mistakes. Try again, Malfoy scoffed. My entire legacy involves my mistakes. I'm judged for a past where I've caused pain, inflicted misery, and even brought death. I don't say this with pride. I say this because it's a fact. The muscle in his arm jumped when she covered it in salve. I don't care what anyone thinks of me. His voice was softer, but still edged with steel. I don't care if they think I've changed or if I'm still a Death Eater scum. My job isn't to appeal to the masses. Says the man voted each weekly's most eligible bachelor. Hermione chuckled dryly, feeling a bit strange that she'd even brought it up. Still, she found herself curious about his response. More so as the seconds passed and the silence returned. I'm not a bachelor. Though barely audible, Hermione heard him loud and clear. I'm a widower. There's a difference. The moment was taut, like a spider's web, stretching on, coiling around her, trapping her until all she could do was focus on him. The ridiculous pounding of her heart, and the way Malfoy seemed to shift, the way he spoke. Regardless of my mother's goals and ambitions, my priorities are firmly outside of remarriage. I value my family, its history, and the duty I have to preserve it. At one point, that was all I knew, all I was. The deep tenor of his voice drew her closer. But I am different now. I am no longer willing to be the bargaining chip she intends me to be. At this moment, I'm stretched too thin, too busy to devote my attention to dissecting nothing. Hermione held her breath at the word. But I am nearly ready, and when I am, I will make my own choice in the matter. Unfortunately for my mother, I won't settle for just any proper witch from a family she deems suitable. I won't settle for being matched to anyone's preference other than my own. I have no regrets, but I am not the person I was when I married the first time. Now, I have expectations of those I let close. I won't be someone's backup plan. If it's not real or genuine, I don't want it. There was nothing to say after such a decisive statement. For several minutes, Hermione worked in shaky silence, with Malfoy watching every step of the way. Her mind was going 1,000,000 kilometers a second, replaying his statement over and over until they overlapped her own words with Ron, and even Narcissa. It made her head hurt. How does your shoulder feel? Better. A drying blonde head turned, catching her eyes. What salve? Something I created for Dolores, Harry's secretary. Malfoy's eyebrow shot up. Then the other joined as he made a small noise that caused Hermione to lift her eyes over to his, then back. Something to say? No. There was a short pause. Except that you brew with books. Not this again. Hermione rolled her eyes, but she found herself relieved for the break in the suffocating tension, even a bit humored by their ever-constant topic of argument. Inventing anything takes time and experimentation that can't be found in a book. It's a risk that can't always be calculated. You don't strike me as the risky sort, at least not anymore. I've brewed a few things without books. Warmth spread across her cheeks. Lately. Oh? Yes, but not this. Perhaps I did consult a few potions masters when I created the salve to make certain the composition was correct. I'm not ashamed about using my resources, especially on something that works. Considering the current state of his skin, it worked pretty well. Besides, I think I've taken enough risks in my life, keeping us alive year after year, trying to fix what was broken after the war in a ministry that wasn't interested in doing any of that. I nearly broke myself, being everything to the same people who wanted me back to work days after I nearly died. The point is, I don't need to be that person anymore, the one that has to have all the answers. I won't apologize for preferring guarantees where I can reasonably have them. I didn't think anything was guaranteed. Not even tomorrow. Malfoy wasn't wrong, but it was too late for a true debate. Reaching for a pain potion, she uncorked the lid and handed it to him to shut him up. When Malfoy made no move to accept it, she huffed. Take it. She held his gaze, watching his jaw as it worked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed around nothing. Hermione lifted the vial into his sightline, noticing how one beat of her heart after the other passed before gray eyes flickered to what it was she was offering. It will help. Still, he made no move to grab it. Pain doesn't always make you stronger, Malfoy, only weaker, insensitive. It wears you thin. When pain is all you know, how can you feel anything else? How do you know there's nothing more? Is there? Hermione couldn't shake the coiling feeling in her gut. Trouble. The cords of energy between them were all but saturated with it, and other things that churned, growing to something tangible, something that would no longer be ignored or pushed aside. Attraction. But she couldn't focus on that, not when the impossibly stubborn man finally took the vial from her hand. Eyes on her, even as he tipped his head back and drank. He downed the contents all in one go. I'll bring you another tomorrow. You'll need it. Malfoy remained quiet while Hermione carefully watched each moment extend into the next. The uptick in her pulse and the way his body began to relax as the potion took hold. The tingling of her fingertips from the salve. The way his head tilted slightly, eyes focused but slightly hazy from the sudden reduction of pain before he looked down, bringing his other arm to his bicep. She watched him test, work, and flex the muscle of his shoulder, moving it in a circular fashion, and she noted it seemed far easier than before. Allowing her eyes to scan the expanse of his arm, from shoulder to fingertip, she touched different parts to test if the pain and strength, but he no longer flinched. Isn't that better? In an attempt to lighten the heaviness between them, Hermione smiled and rolled her eyes. You're too much of a prat to admit it, but I'll take your silence as a sign of gratitude and celebrate my victory by sleeping peacefully tonight. It was quick. A blink and she would have missed it, but Malfoy raked a hand through his nearly dry hair, glancing off to the side at nothing. He made a small sound that was curiously close to a chuckle before a smile played at the edges of his lips. It looked like a reflex or an accident, new to witness but all him. Natural. Genuine. It faded the moment he caught her staring. It's late, Granger. It is. But neither moved. Not at first. Then Malfoy stood and picked up his shirt. It was nothing she hadn't seen already, but his proximity left her rattled. Good night. As he left, Hermione blinked at his back. No matter the intention, the combination of the something that she'd been subconsciously starving and the nothing she wanted so badly to believe in was just what that seed of attraction needed to grow. Only now the roots were far too deep to pull. I think change is good because it teaches you that it's nothing to be frightened of. Helen McCrory. This chapter was dedicated to the incomparable Helen McCrory, who played Narcissa Malfoy, and a host of other wonderful characters. Sadly, she died after a fight with cancer. Thoughts to her family and friends. Wands up.